The waiter kept smiling like nothing in the world was wrong, while my screen flashed a small, quiet sentence that changed the shape of my afternoon. Transaction declined. For a second, I thought it was the light in the restaurant playing tricks on my eyes. The place was all warm wood and lemon cleaner, with a chalkboard menu and a bell over the door that rang every time someone came in. My mother-in-law, Ruth, sat across from me, her purse perched on her lap like a polite secret. She had ordered the grilled salmon and a glass of iced tea with 2 lemons, the way she always did. I'd gone with soup and a sandwich because I was trying to be good to my body and my budget at the same time. We'd laughed about how neither of us ever finished our fries. The waiter's pen hovered. "Sometimes the machine's fussy," he said kindly, and tried again. Declined. I felt heat climb my neck. I could hear the espresso machine hiss like it was gossiping about me. I reached for my wallet with a little joke ready, something about technology being moody, but my fingers were already trembling. "Use mine," Ruth said, too quickly, like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her card declined too. We stared at each other, the way people do when a small, ordinary embarrassment starts to grow teeth. "Maybe the signal," I said, and hated how thin my voice sounded. The waiter tried the old machine by the counter. The bell rang again. A woman laughed near the window. Life kept moving, and there we were, stuck. "Let me step outside and call my bank," I said, already standing. The sidewalk was warm, and the air smelled like bread and exhaust. My phone buzzed with a notification before I could dial. "We've temporarily blocked your card due to suspicious activity." Ruth's phone did the same. That's when I felt it, the small, sharp click inside me, like a lock turning. Because 2 cards don't get blocked at the same time by accident. Not like that. Not after a month where nothing in my life had felt accidental at all. Inside, we paid with cash from the bottom of Ruth's purse, crumpled bills she'd been saving for the farmer's market, and walked out quieter than we'd come in. The bell sounded like an apology, or a warning. I couldn't tell which. Before that day, my life was the kind you can describe with safe words: steady, busy, ordinary. I worked as a project coordinator at a small construction firm, the kind of job where your desk is always a little dusty no matter how much you wipe it down. My husband, Mark, managed inventory at a warehouse and came home smelling faintly of cardboard and coffee. We had been married 11 years, long enough to stop counting anniversaries by gifts and start counting them by inside jokes. We had 1 son, Daniel, who was 9 and believed cereal was a food group. Ruth lived 10 minutes away in a neat brick house with rose bushes she pruned like they were her children, too. She had been a widow for 7 years and carried her loneliness like a folded coat, always there, but not something she made a show of. We had our rhythm: Sunday dinners at her place, Wednesday phone calls, the occasional lunch when our schedules lined up. She was not the meddling kind of mother-in-law you hear about. She was practical, organized, a little too proud of her color-coded calendar. Money had always been not a problem, but not a pillow either. We paid our bills, put a little away, argued gently about whether a little meant enough. I kept our accounts because numbers soothed me. I liked seeing things add up. I liked the quiet order of it. Mark said it made him anxious, so he trusted me with it, and I tried to be worthy of that trust. In the weeks before the lunch, life had been louder than usual. The warehouse was understaffed, so Mark came home later, his shoulders tight, his answers shorter. Daniel had joined a soccer team and tracked mud through the house like it was a second job. I'd taken on an extra project at work, which meant more emails and fewer deep breaths. And then there were the little things, the kind you don't notice until you do. One night, folding laundry, I found a receipt in Mark's jeans pocket for a gas station 2 towns over. We don't drive that way. I told myself he must have taken a different route for work. Another time, the bank app lagged when I tried to open it, and when it finally loaded, the balance looked off. Not wrong exactly, just not what my mind expected to see. I refreshed. It corrected itself. I laughed at my own jumpiness. Ruth's fart, for her part, had been quieter, too. She'd started canceling our Wednesday calls, saying she had things to sort. Once, when I stopped by to drop off soup, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low, not her usual clear bell. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a smile that stayed on her mouth and didn't travel to her eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Always," she said, and patted my arm like you do a child who's asked a question you don't want to answer. I didn't push. I'm good at not pushing. It's a skill you learn when you want peace more than you want truth, at least in the moment. The lunch had been her idea. Just us, she'd said, like old times. We chose the cafe because it was halfway between our houses and because their soup tasted like someone's grandmother had meant it to. We talked about Daniel's soccer cleats, about the neighbor who'd painted his fence neon blue, about the way summer was coming in hot and impatient. We did not talk about Mark working late. We did not talk about the quiet in her voice. We did not talk about the way my phone had started to buzz with bank notifications I'd been too busy to open. And then declined, and that small, quiet sentence. In the car, Ruth kept her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window like she was counting trees. "It's probably nothing," she said. "Banks do that sometimes." "Both at once?" I asked, trying to keep the tone light. She shrugged, but it was a stiff motion. "Stranger things have happened." When I got home, Daniel was at the table, homework spread out like a paper city. Mark wasn't back yet. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and pencil shavings. I put my purse down and opened my laptop with the kind of care you use around something fragile. The account page loaded. It took a second too long. My heart did a small, unhelpful dance. There it was again, that not quite right feeling. A series of withdrawals I didn't recognize, small enough to hide in the shadows of groceries and gas, but steady, like someone had been tapping our life with a teaspoon over and over, trusting we wouldn't notice the sound. I called the bank. A calm voice explained the block. "We flagged unusual activity," she said. "We'll reverse what we can, but we'll need to review." "Unusual how?" I asked. She paused, the way people do when they're choosing between being precise and being kind. "Multiple transactions from a new device over several weeks." A new device. The words sat in my chest like a stone. Mark came home while I was still on hold. He kissed the top of my head, asked about my day. I told him about lunch, about the declined cards. He frowned, the crease between his brows deepening. "That's weird," he said. "Must be some glitch." I looked at his hands. They were steady. That night, after Daniel was asleep and the house had settled into its soft, ticking quiet, I lay awake and listened to Mark breathe. I thought about Ruth's quick offer to pay, about her crumpled bills, about the way she said stranger things. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself a lot of gentle lies, the way you do when you're not ready for the sharp ones. But the lock inside me had turned, and I could feel a door somewhere slowly beginning to open. The next morning, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Sunlight came in through the kitchen window in a thin, pale strip that didn't quite reach the table. Daniel was already dressed for school, tapping his spoon against his bowl like he was keeping time with a song only he could hear. Mark stood by the counter, scrolling through his phone, coffee going cold in his hand. I watched him the way you watch someone when you're trying not to watch them. "Did the bank say when it'll be fixed?" he asked, casual, eyes still on the screen. "They said they're reviewing," I said. I buttered toast I didn't want. The knife made a soft scraping sound that felt louder than it should have. "They mentioned transactions from a new device." He looked up then, just for a second. "Huh, maybe when you logged in from your work computer?" "I don't," I said. "I only use my phone and the laptop here." "Oh." He took a sip of coffee, winced because it was cold, and poured it down the sink. "Weird."
Weird was a word we'd been using a lot lately. Weird hours, weird moods, weird little silences where there used to be easy noise. After Daniel left, I called Ruth. She answered on the third ring, breathless, like she'd been moving. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said too fast, then laughed. "I mean, as okay as banks make anything." "Did they say anything specific to you?" I asked. "About why your card was blocked too?" "They said something about security. You know how it is." There was a pause, filled with the sound of something clinking, maybe dishes. "I'm sure it'll sort itself out." "Ruth," I said, and heard the way my own voice had sharpened without my permission, "did you notice any strange charges before this?" Another pause, longer. "I don't check as often as you do, dear." That was true. Ruth treated her accounts like old paperwork, necessary but not something you leaf through unless you have to. Still, the stone in my chest didn't move. At work, I tried to focus on schedules and emails and the small, stubborn problems of other people's buildings, but my mind kept circling the same narrow street. New device, several weeks, small withdrawals. I pulled up my statements during lunch and started marking the ones that didn't fit. 20 here, 35 there, enough to be forgettable until they weren't. There was a pattern if you squinted at it, mostly gas stations, a few grocery stores I didn't recognize, once a hardware store. Mark sometimes picked things up on the way home, but he usually told me, and he didn't drive through 2 towns to do it. When I got home, the mail was on the mat. Among the bills and flyers was an envelope from the bank, my name in neat print. My hands felt clumsy opening it. They were reversing some charges, investigating others. There was a number to call if I had questions. I had a lot of questions. Mark came in late again. He said the warehouse had a surprise audit. He said it like it was a joke. I nodded like it was one. We ate reheated pasta and watched a show we both pretended to enjoy. When he went to shower, I sat at the table with his phone in my hand and told myself I was just going to check the time. I didn't. I checked the App Store. There it was, a banking app update downloaded 3 weeks ago, on a day he'd said he was working a double. I put the phone down like it was warm. Sleep came in pieces that night. In one of them, I was back in the cafe, and the bell wouldn't stop ringing, and every time I tried to pay, the screen flashed that same small, quiet sentence. The bank called the next afternoon. "We can confirm there were unauthorized transactions," the representative said. Her voice was careful, practiced. "We're also seeing activity linked to another account with a shared address." "Another account?" I said. "Yes, ma'am. It appears your mother-in-law's account was accessed from the same device." The room tilted just a little. "You're saying the same person?" "I'm saying the same device," she said gently. "We can't identify the individual without further investigation, but the access points match." After I hung up, I sat very still. The house was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower started and stopped. Ruth and Mark, my 2 fixed points. The idea that they were connected in this made my stomach turn in a way that wasn't just about money. I drove to Ruth's house without calling. The roses were in full, stubborn bloom, red against the brick like small flags. She opened the door with a smile that faltered when she saw my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Can we talk?" I said. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she taught Daniel to roll dough. I told her what the bank said, about the device, about the pattern. She listened, her hands folded, her eyes on the table. "Ruth," I said, softer now, "is there something you want to tell me?" She looked up then, and for a second I saw something like fear, or maybe it was just tiredness. "No," she said, "I don't know anything about devices and patterns. I know my card didn't work, that's all." "Did you lend anyone your phone?" I asked. "No." "Did anyone help you set up your banking app recently?" She shook her head. "You know I don't like those things." I did know, or I thought I did. When I left, the roses looked too bright, like they were trying to distract me. That night, Mark's phone buzzed while he was in the garage. A message preview lit up the screen. "We need to talk about what happened. I'm scared." It wasn't from me. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. The lock inside me turned again, and this time the door didn't creak, it swung. I waited until he came back in, his hands smelling of oil, his face careful. "Who's scared?" I asked, and held up the phone. He looked at it, then at me. The room felt very small. "Anna," he said, my name like he was reaching for a railing. "It's not what you think." That's what people say when it's almost exactly what you think. "Then tell me what it is," I said. He sat down slowly. The chair made a sound like a complaint. "Mom called me earlier," he said. "She's worried about the cards, about things." "About what things?" I asked. He rubbed his face. "Money's been tight for her, tighter than she lets on. I've been helping her out, a little." "With my account?" I asked. "With access," he said, and didn't look at me. The words landed, heavy and unfinished.
"With access," he said, and didn't look at me. I waited for the rest of the sentence the way you wait for a doctor to come back into the room, already braced, still hoping. The kitchen light hummed. Somewhere in the house, a pipe knocked like it had an opinion. "What does that mean, Mark?" I asked. My voice surprised me by staying level. "With access to what?" He took a breath that sounded practiced. "To the accounts. I didn't think it would be a big deal, just small amounts, just to get her through a rough patch." "You gave her my login," I said. He winced. "I helped her set up the app. She doesn't understand those things. She was embarrassed to ask you." "And you didn't think to ask me," I said. The word "me" came out thin. "I was going to," he said quickly. She needed it right then, and it was my mom, and you always say family comes first." "I do say that, or I used to." It sounded different in his mouth. "So you took money without telling me," I said, "for weeks." "Borrowed," he corrected, finally looking at me. His eyes were tired, not guilty in the way I expected. "We were going to put it back as soon as things evened out." "Things like what?" I asked. He hesitated. The room filled with that hesitation like fog. "She's been paying off some old medical bills and helping someone." "Helping who?" He shook his head. "It's not my story to tell." "That's convenient," I said. I could hear my heart now, loud and unhelpful. "The bank says the same device accessed her account and mine. So this isn't just you helping her. This is you moving money around without telling me and getting both of our cards blocked." "It was never supposed to get flagged," he said, like that was the point. "I kept the amount small." "You kept them secret," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I didn't want to worry you." I stood up because sitting felt like sinking. "You didn't want to be honest." We stood there, the two of us, with the space between like a third person who wouldn't leave. "I need air," I said, and went out onto the porch. The evening smelled like cut grass and someone else's dinner. I leaned on the railing and tried to remember the last time Mark and I had talked about money without turning it into a list. He came out after a minute. "Anna," he said soft, "I messed up. I know I did, but it's not like there's another woman or something." "That's a low bar," I said, and surprised us both with a small, broken laugh. "You want credit for not cheating while you stole from our account." "Borrowed," he said again, then stopped when he saw my face. "Okay, took. I took it. I'm sorry." "Did Ruth know?" I asked. He hesitated. That was answer enough. "She did," I said. "She didn't want to put you in the middle," he said. "She hates asking for help." "She hates asking me," I said, and felt something old and sharp twist. "So she asked you." He nodded.
I thought of the cafe, of her quick offer to pay, of the crumpled bills. "How bad is it?" I asked. He looked at the floor. "A few thousand." The word thousand has weight. It landed like dropping a plate. "For how long?" I asked. "Since late spring." We were in the middle of summer now. I went back inside and sat down at the table. My hands were shaking, so I put them flat on the wood like I was trying to feel the house hold me up. "I need the truth," I said. "All of it, not the edited version." He sat across from me like he had at 100 dinners, and this time he didn't look away. "She fell behind after the surgery. Insurance didn't cover everything. She used her savings. Then the roof leak happened. Then her friend Leela needed help with rent, and Mom couldn't say no. It kept stacking. I told her I'd handle it for a bit." "And you decided to handle it with my money," I said. "With our money," he said gently, like he was smoothing a wrinkle. "Not without telling me," I said. He nodded. I know. I was trying to protect everyone. You, her, us." "From what?" I asked. "From a conversation?" He didn't answer. We sat there in the quiet. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked, ordinary sounds in a suddenly unordinary house. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" I asked. "Yes," he said too quickly. Then he sighed. "I kept waiting for the right time." "The right time, is that before or after the bank blocks our cards in public?" He flinched. "I need to talk to Ruth," I said. He nodded. "She's scared you'll be angry." I laughed again because sometimes laughter is the only thing that fits in a room full of glass. "Tell her I already am." The next day we went together. Ruth's house looked the same. The roses were still trying. She let us in and made tea with hands that weren't quite steady. "I didn't want this," she said as soon as we sat down. "I told him not to." "You let him," I said. She looked at me then, really looked, and there was something like shame in her eyes. "I was drowning," she said, "and he threw me a rope. I didn't stop to ask where it was tied." "You tied it to me," I said, and felt the words like a bruise. "I was going to pay it back," she said, "when the insurance refund comes, when Leela gets on her feet, when, I said, and stopped her with my hand. "You were going to keep it secret." "Yes," she said once. "I didn't want you to see me like this." "Like what?" I asked. "Like human?" She swallowed. "Like a burden." The word sat between us, heavy and small. "I would have helped," I said, and meant it, "if you had asked." I know. That's why I couldn't." Mark reached for my hand, then thought better of it and let it fall back to his lap. The bank called later that day. They'd reversed some charges. Others were still under review. We'd need to come in, show IDs, sign forms. There would be fees. There would be time. There would be conversations. That night, Mark slept on the couch without either of us saying it out loud. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house remember us. I wasn't thinking of leaving, not yet. I was thinking about trust, about how it's not one big thing you break, but 100 small ones you don't notice until the room is empty. In the morning, Daniel asked why Dad was on the couch. I said he'd fallen asleep watching a movie. It was a small lie, and it tasted like chalk. At work, I couldn't concentrate. I kept seeing numbers, remembered the words. I took my lunch in the car and called the bank again, asked for a printout of everything. I wanted the shape of the truth, even if it hurt to hold. When I got home, there was an email from Ruth, just one line. "I'm so sorry I made you pay for my pride." I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply. Not yet.
The printout from the bank came in a thick official envelope that felt heavier than paper should. I spread the pages out on the dining table like a map of somewhere I hadn't meant to travel. Dates, amounts, store names that started to look familiar in the worst way. It wasn't just gas and groceries. There were pharmacy charges.
a hardware store receipt that matched the new gutter I'd admired on Ruth's house and assumed she'd finally called a professional for. There were 2 cash withdrawals I didn't recognize at all. Mark sat across from me, quiet, hands folded. He'd offered to make coffee. I said no. The smell felt like it would be too much. "This one," I said, tapping a line with my finger. $300, cash. What was that for? He took a breath. "Lila's rent." She was short. "And this?" I tapped another. "The pharmacy?" "Mom's medication. Insurance didn't cover that one." "And this?" I moved down the page. $200 at the hardware store. He looked away. "The gutter." "So the roof leak," I said, "that was real." "Yes," he said quickly, "that was real." The word real did something strange in the room, like we were negotiating what counted. "How much of this did Ruth actually know about?" I asked. "All of it," he said after a moment. "She asked me to keep track." "To keep track," I repeated, "on my account." He nodded. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them, the pages were still there. "You should have told me," I said. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was a statement of weather. "I know," he said. "I was wrong." There are apologies that come with plans attached and apologies that are just words. I needed more than words, but I didn't know what the plan was yet. We went to the bank together that afternoon. The lobby smelled like carpet cleaner and paper. A woman with careful makeup walked us through forms and signatures and a timeline. "Some funds have been recovered," she said. "Some will need to investigate further. Because the access came from a known device, it complicates things." "Complicates," I said, and signed my name. On the way out, Mark touched my elbow like he was asking permission without speaking. I didn't pull away. I also didn't lean in. Lila called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. Her voice was smaller than usual. "I'll pay it back," she said. "Every penny, I promise. I didn't know how to ask you without feeling like I was asking for something I don't deserve." That word again. Deserve. I wondered when she decided she didn't. The discovery wasn't a single moment. It was a slow unpacking. Each page, each conversation, another small cut. I learned that the new device the bank mentioned was Mark's old phone, the one he'd said he'd recycled but had kept as a backup. He'd set up both apps on it so he could move money quietly without notifications popping up on the family tablet or my phone. "Quietly," I said when he told me. He didn't argue. I learned that the pattern started after Ruth's surgery, but it grew after Lila came into the picture, a friend from her church who'd fallen behind and was too proud to tell anyone else. Ruth saw herself in that pride. Mark saw himself as the solution. And I saw myself, for the first time in weeks, as the last to know. We told Daniel something vague about bank problems and grown-up stuff. He accepted it with the easy faith of a child who believes his parents are still the walls. I hated that I was holding cracks behind my back. The confrontation wasn't loud. It wasn't a scene. It was a series of quiet rooms and tired eyes. At Ruth's house, a week later, we sat again at her kitchen table. She'd baked scones like a peace offering. The smell of butter and sugar hung in the air, hopeful and out of place. "I've started listing things to sell," she said. "The china cabinet, the old sewing machine. I don't need them." "You don't have to sell your life," I said, and surprised myself with the steadiness of it. "You have to talk to me." She looked at me like I'd offered her something fragile. I didn't want to be a burden. "You weren't," I said. "You are my family, but you made a choice for me. Both of you did." Mark nodded. "We did." Silence sat with us. The clock on the wall ticked like it was counting something we couldn't see. "What happens now?" Ruth asked. It was a small question with a big shadow. "I don't know," I said honestly. "The bank will finish the investigation. We'll figure out the money. But the rest of it, that takes longer. Mark's eyes were on the table. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. I wanted to believe him. I also wanted to believe that wanting was enough. The public consequence started quietly, the way most real consequences do. The bank sent letters. The warehouse called Mark in for a meeting because a payroll advance he'd taken to try to patch one of the holes had raised a flag. Ruth's church friend found out and insisted on paying back what she could, which wasn't much, and cried in Ruth's living room like she'd been caught stealing apples. None of it was dramatic in the way movies are dramatic. It was paperwork and uncomfortable conversations and a slow, steady sense of being seen in places you'd hope to stay invisible. At work, I made mistakes I usually didn't make. At home, Mark tried too hard. Too many flowers, too many offers to cook, too many careful questions that felt like he was tiptoeing around a floor he'd helped crack. One night, after Daniel was asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I don't know how to trust you right now." He sat beside me, close but not touching. "I know," he said. "I don't either, but I want to learn." "Learning takes time," I said. "I have time," he said. I didn't answer, because time is something you don't get to promise. Lila sent me updates like a student reporting to a teacher, what she'd sold, what she'd paid back, what the insurance finally covered. I replied with short, polite messages, not cold, not warm, something in between, like a room you're still airing out. The day the bank confirmed the investigation was closed and that we'd recovered most of what we could, I sat in my car and cried, not because it was over, but because it wasn't. Money can be counted. Trust is harder. That evening, Lila came over with a folder of receipts and a cake she bought because baking felt like too much. We sat at the table. Daniel did his homework. The house tried to be normal. "I'm sorry," she said again, and this time it didn't feel like a word she was using to make things smaller. It felt like a door she was standing in. "I know," I said. Mark watched us, quiet. There were still questions about boundaries, about what family means when it's tangled with pride, about what I needed to feel safe again. I wasn't ready to answer them all, but I knew one thing. Pretending nothing had happened was not an option, and neither was pretending that everyone involved was only a villain or only a victim. We were all more complicated than that, even me.
The plan, if you could call it that, started as a list on the back of an envelope. I wrote it at the kitchen counter while Daniel built a crooked tower of blocks on the floor and Mark washed dishes he'd already washed once. The envelope had come with one of the bank letters. I flipped it over and wrote in a careful hand, like neatness could keep the words from moving. New accounts, budget review, payback schedule, boundaries. I underlined the last one twice. Mark dried his hands and stood beside me. He didn't look at the list right away. He looked at my face, like he was trying to read something that kept changing. "I'll do whatever you want," he said. "That's not a plan," I said. "That's a promise, and promises are what got us here." He nodded, slow. "Okay, tell me what the plan is." So we made one. We closed the old accounts and opened new ones in both our names, with notifications turned on for everything. We set a strict budget, the kind that feels like wearing shoes that are half a size too small. We wrote a repayment schedule for Ruth, not because I needed to squeeze her, but because I needed to see an endpoint. And we talked about boundaries, which is a word that sounds clean until you try to draw them with people you love. "I can't be the last to know," I said, "about money, about anything that affects us." "I know," he said. "And you can't make decisions for me because you think I'll be upset," I said. "You don't get to manage my feelings like that." He swallowed. "I was trying to protect you." "You were protecting yourself from a hard conversation," I said, not unkindly. "There's a difference." We agreed to couples counseling.
The word agreed makes it sound smooth. It wasn't. It was a tired truce, a handshake after a storm. Ruth took the list seriously. She brought over her own notebook full of careful handwriting and crossed out numbers. "I can pay this much each month," she said, pointing, "and if I sell the cabinet, maybe more." "You don't have to sell everything," I said. "I want to," she said. "I need to feel like I'm standing again." We let her. Pride is a tricky thing. It can break you, but it can also be part of how you mend. The public part of it kept rippling. At church, someone had heard something, and then someone else had heard something else. Ruth came home from one service with her shoulders tight and said, "People mean well, they just don't know how to ask without staring." At the warehouse, Mark's hours got cut for a while. "They say it's temporary," he said, and tried to sound like he believed it. We tightened the budget another notch. Shoes that were already too small started to pinch. There were nights when the house felt like a meeting room. Calm voices, careful words, agendas that never quite fit on one page. And then there were nights when Daniel would climb into our bed with a nightmare, and Mark would reach for my hand in the dark, like he always had, and I would let him, because muscle memory is a kind of hope. The action I took wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge. It was something quieter and harder. I started telling the truth sooner. When Ruth asked if she could help Lila again with groceries, I said, "We can talk about it together." When Mark's manager called about overtime opportunities, I asked to see the numbers. When my own fear showed up as irritation, I tried to name it before it named me. We went to couples counseling in a small office that smelled of mint and old books. The counselor had a way of asking questions that felt like opening windows in rooms you'd kept shut. "What does money mean to you?" she asked one afternoon. "Safety," I said, without thinking. "Loyalty," Mark said at the same time. We looked at each other, surprised. Those aren't opposites, but they can pull in different directions. We talked about his mom, about my need for order, about how easy it is to turn love into a secret when you're afraid of what honesty will cost. There were setbacks, a late bill, a misunderstanding, a night when Mark snapped, "Do you trust me or not?" And I said, "Not the way I did," and we both had to sit with that. The public consequence, the part you can point to, came when the bank closed the case and Mark's workplace finished their review. He wasn't fired, but he was put on probation. Ruth's church put together a quiet fund for people in crisis, and she insisted on contributing to it once she was steadier, like she was paying forward an apology. People knew. Not everyone, not all the details, but enough. Enough that sometimes I felt like we were walking with a sign we hadn't asked for. The strange thing was, the world didn't end. It just kept going. The cafe bell still rang, the espresso machine still hissed, we still didn't finish our fries. One afternoon, months later, Ruth and I went back to that same place for lunch. We both brought cash, a small shared joke we didn't quite laugh at. We sat in the same seats. She ordered the same salmon. I ordered soup and a sandwich. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said, stirring her tea. "I didn't," I said. "I just stopped pretending we didn't need to change." She nodded. "I'm learning to ask." "That's new for both of us," I said. At home, Mark and I started having money meetings on Sundays. They were about as romantic as folding laundry, which is to say, not at all and very necessary. Sometimes we argued, sometimes we surprised each other. Sometimes we ended them with a walk around the block because it was easier to talk when our bodies were moving. The action wasn't a single brave moment. It was a series of small, stubborn choices to stay in the room and keep the lights on. I don't want to make it sound like everything fixed itself. Trust isn't a switch. It's a practice. Some days I still check the app more often than I need to. Some days Mark still over-explains. Some days Ruth still brings her notebook like it's a shield. But there are also days when we forget to be careful for a while and nothing bad happens. And that feels like a kind of miracle. The thing about consequences is that they don't arrive all at once. They come in waves, some small enough to step over, some that knock you off balance when you're not looking. The first big wave hit at Ruth's church. She called me one Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight but steady. "They asked me to speak," she said. "About what?" I asked, already guessing. "About the fund," she said. "About what happened. Not all of it, just enough to explain why it exists." I pictured her standing at the front of that familiar room, hands folded, voice clear. The idea made my stomach twist. "Do you want to?" I asked. "No," she said, and then corrected herself. "Yes, I think I need to." So we went. Mark sat with Daniel in the back. I sat near the aisle, close enough to see Ruth's hands shake when she unfolded her notes. She didn't tell our story. She told hers, about pride, about fear, about how easy it is to accept help the wrong way when you're afraid to ask for it the right way. She didn't name Mark. She didn't name me, but people understood. You could feel it in the quiet that followed. After, a woman hugged her and said, "Thank you for being brave." Another pressed an envelope into her hand and said, "For the fund." Ruth tried to refuse. The woman wouldn't let her. On the drive home, Ruth stared out the window like she was watching something change shape. "I feel lighter," she said, "and heavier." "That's usually how it goes," I said. The second wave was at the warehouse. Mark came home one evening with a paper bag of his things and that careful look he gets when he's trying not to scare me. "It's not what it looks like," he said, which is a sentence that never helps. "They're restructuring," he said. "My position got cut. They offered a smaller role, fewer hours. I said yes." We sat at the table and did the math again. The numbers were tighter. The shoes pinched. We adjusted. Again. The third wave was smaller, but it hurt more. Daniel came home from school quiet. At dinner, he pushed his peas around like they were obstacles. "Someone said Grandma took money," he said, not looking at us. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. "Kids talk," Mark said, too quickly. "Is it true?" Daniel asked. We had promised ourselves we wouldn't lie. Not big lies. Not anymore. "Grandma needed help," I said. "We handled it the wrong way. We're fixing it." He thought about that. "Is she in trouble?" "No," Mark said. "She's okay, and so are we." Daniel nodded, then asked for more bread. The world, for him, stayed mostly the same. For me, it shifted in small, careful ways. The public consequence wasn't a courtroom or a headline. It was these moments, being seen, being talked about, being adjusted around. It was the way some people got a little too kind and others got a little quiet. It was learning to hold your head up without pretending you hadn't tripped. Ruth started volunteering with the fund she'd helped create. "If I'm going to be part of the story, I want to be part of the work," she said. Mark picked up extra shifts where he could. I took on a small freelance project at night. We were tired. We were also, in a strange way, more honest. One evening, months after the cafe, we were back there again. Not together this time. I was meeting a coworker. When the waiter brought the check, my phone buzzed with a notification. Transaction approved. I felt a ridiculous swell of relief for something so ordinary. On the way home, I drove past Ruth's house. The rose bushes had been trimmed back. They looked healthier for it. The public part kept echoing in small rooms. At a neighborhood barbecue, someone asked, "How's your mom?" a little too carefully. At work, a colleague said, "Banks are such a mess these days," and watched my face like it was a weather report. I learned to answer without flinching. "We're sorting it out," I'd say. And we were. The biggest consequence, though, wasn't out there. It was inside the way I thought about trust. I used to think trust was a thing you had or you didn't, like a light switch. Now I know it's more like a garden. You notice when someone's been walking through it without telling you. You decide whether to replant. One night, after a long week, Mark and I sat on the porch with 2 mugs of tea that had gone cold. The street was quiet. Someone's dog barked and then stopped. "I miss when we didn't have to talk about this stuff," he said. "I don't," I said, and surprised myself again. "I miss when we didn't have to worry, but I don't miss not knowing." He nodded. "I'm trying to be the person you can know." "I see that," I said. Ruth came over the next Sunday with a small envelope. "Final payment," she said, like she was saying a vow. I didn't open it right away. I hugged her. She was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing her without the armor. "Thank you," I said, "for letting me make it right," she said. We had dinner. We laughed a little. Daniel told a story about school that went on too long. It was good. It was ordinary. It was hard-won. The public consequence fades in layers. People find new things to talk about. You find new ways to breathe. The sign you didn't ask for gets smaller, then disappears. What stays is the work, the meetings, the lists, the conversations that start with, "Can we talk about something?" and don't end with slammed doors. We weren't fixed. We were fixing. And that, I learned, is sometimes the more honest ending.
Healing doesn't announce itself. It shows up like light through a curtain you forgot to open, quiet, a little surprising, and easy to miss if you're still watching the door for storms. The first sign, for me, was a Tuesday. Not a big Tuesday, not an anniversary or a holiday, just a Tuesday where I realized I hadn't checked the bank app all morning. I'd made Daniel's lunch, answered 3 emails, and argued gently with Mark about whether the trash was actually full before it occurred to me that my old habit, thumb hovering, heart braced, had gone quiet. When I did check, everything was normal. The word felt new again. I closed the app and stood there for a second, letting the refrigerator hum fill the space where worry used to sit. Ruth kept her word. Every month, like a small ceremony, she'd bring over a check and a slice of whatever she'd baked. Sometimes we'd sit and talk. Sometimes she'd just hand it to me and say, "See you Sunday." The cabinet sold. The sewing machine went to a young woman who cried and hugged her like she'd been given more than wood and metal. Ruth didn't look back when it left. "I'm keeping the table," she said once, touching the edge of it like she was greeting an old friend. "Some things should stay." Mark's smaller role at work became permanent, and then slowly, with the patience of someone rebuilding, he moved into a new position in a different department. Less stress, less money, more evenings home. We adjusted again. The shoes still pinched sometimes, but not enough to make us limp. Counseling turned into a rhythm. We learned how to fight without trying to win. We learned how to say, "I'm scared," before we said, "You always." We learned that loyalty and safety don't have to compete if you put them on the same team. One afternoon, the counselor asked, "What would trust look like if it were growing instead of returning?" The question sat with me longer than the answer. Trust growing meant it wouldn't look like it used to. It wouldn't be the old, unexamined thing. It would be something with fences and gates and signs you could read in the dark. It would be something you tended. At home, we made a rule: no financial decisions alone. It sounded simple. It was not. It meant pausing when you wanted to fix something quickly. It meant admitting when you didn't know. It meant calling each other in from the other room and saying, "Can we look at this together?" Sometimes we forgot. Sometimes we remembered too late. We kept practicing anyway. Daniel started asking more questions about money, not the anxious kind, just the curious kind. "How much does soccer cost? Why do we have 2 different jars for saving?
We answered. We showed him the list on the fridge, and we let him help decide whether we could afford ice cream that week. He took it seriously in the way only kids do, like it was a game with invisible rules. Ruth joined us for some of those talks. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, it was often to say, "I wish I'd learned this sooner." Not with regret exactly, with a kind of relief. The day the last check cleared, I didn't feel like celebrating. I felt quiet, like a room after furniture has been moved out and you're waiting to see what belongs there now. We marked it with dinner anyway. Nothing fancy. Pasta, bread, a salad that went a little brown at the edges. Ruth brought a bottle of sparkling cider because she didn't want it to feel like we were pretending. We raised our glasses. "To endings," Mark said. "To beginnings," Ruth said. Daniel said, "To dessert," which felt right. Later, when the dishes were done and the house had settled, Ruth stood by the door and held my hands. "Thank you for not making me smaller than my mistake," she said. I thought about all the times I'd wanted to, about how easy it is to shrink people when you're hurt. I said, "Thank you for not making me carry it alone." She smiled, and for once it reached her eyes. Healing, I learned, is also about memory. The cafe still existed, the bell still rang, but when I walked past it now, I didn't feel that old heat in my neck. I felt something closer to perspective. The day had changed us, yes, but it hadn't defined the rest of our days unless we let it. Mark and I took a weekend trip, the first in a long time. Nothing far, a small town with a river and a diner that served pie in thick slices. We walked, we talked, we didn't talk. We let silence be a place you could rest, not a thing you had to fix. At the second night, sitting on a bench by the water, he said, "I'm still afraid sometimes." I said, "Me too." About what? About being wrong again, about missing something, about thinking I'm safe and finding out I'm not. He nodded. "I'm afraid of hurting you without meaning to." We sat with that, watching the water do what water does, move and keep moving. Maybe being afraid isn't the problem. Maybe pretending we're not is. He took my hand, not like a question this time, like a statement. I let him. Ruth's church fund grew. She kept volunteering. Sometimes she came home tired and proud. Sometimes she came home quiet and thoughtful. She was learning, too, that asking for help doesn't erase your dignity. It can, in a strange way, build it. At work, I stopped making the small mistakes. I started trusting my attention again. I even laughed at a meeting once and meant it. The house felt less like a meeting room and more like a home. We still had lists, we still had talks, but we also had nights where Daniel made us watch a ridiculous video and we laughed until our sides hurt. We had mornings where Mark burned the toast and apologized like it was a confession, and I told him it was fine and meant it. Healing didn't mean forgetting, it meant remembering without flinching. It meant knowing that trust isn't something you get back to, it's something you build forward. And sometimes on quiet Tuesdays, it meant not checking the app at all. The house was quiet that evening. Daniel had fallen asleep in the living room with one leg on the couch and the other on the floor, a textbook half open on the carpet, and Mark had gone outside to check the garden, muttering something about weeds. I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the empty spaces between my thoughts. I held a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm long ago, but I didn't care. I was trying to feel the weight of everything and nothing at once, letting it settle. It had been months since the cards blocked incident, months of whispers and lists and silent frustrations. months of reestablishing trust with Mark, months of sitting across from Ruth and realizing that people, even those closest to you, can make mistakes, big ones, and still be human. Months of learning that honesty isn't a single moment of confession, it's 1,000 tiny choices you make every day, quietly, with your hands visible. Ruth had started showing up more often, not because she owed us anymore, but because she wanted to see us as partners in life again, not just beneficiaries of our patience. She came over last week with a small loaf of banana bread she'd baked herself. "I figured if I'm going to bring a debt, it might as well smell like sugar," she said, laughing softly, eyes crinkled at the corners. And I smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Mark had changed too, though not in dramatic, sweeping gestures. He had started making a habit of telling me when he was going to do anything with our finances, our family matters. He would check in with Ruth in a way that didn't feel secretive but careful, and he began listening when I asked him questions, not defending or excusing himself, just answering. It wasn't magic, it was work, slow and steady, and it was building something more resilient than our old routines had ever offered. Even Daniel had changed. I noticed it in small ways, the way he folded his allowance into separate jars for savings, spending, and giving. He asked more questions, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. "Why do we need 2 accounts now, Mom?" he asked one evening. And instead of rushing through an explanation, I told him in detail how trust worked in money and in relationships, how mistakes don't erase the lessons, and how owning them is just the beginning. He nodded, thoughtful, and then asked if we could make a chart for the week's groceries. I laughed because of course he did. That's how he learned best, with charts and colors and clear markers that told a story better than words alone. Sometimes I still find myself checking the banking app just a little, almost out of habit. I catch the nervous twitch in my stomach and take a deep breath, reminding myself that the danger isn't the numbers, it's the silence that allows missteps to grow. And I try every time to pause before panic. The app no longer feels like a trap, it feels like a tool, a way to see the full picture before acting. I've noticed, too, how ordinary life slowly reclaims its ordinary beauty. The smell of burnt toast from Mark's kitchen experiments, the way Daniel hums when he's building Lego towers taller than he is, the quiet satisfaction when Ruth's roses bloom in her front yard, vibrant against the brick walls. These little moments feel like victories now because they are, because life has a way of giving back the ordinary after it has asked so much of you. Mark and I sit on the porch some evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes with conversation. We don't avoid the past, we acknowledge it. We speak of the lessons, the boundaries, the fears, and sometimes we laugh at how dramatic we both were about such small amounts of money, as if the panic could have done more than show us the truth. We've learned that trust is less a thing you reclaim than a garden you nurture. Some days are weeds, some days are sun, and some days, when you least expect it, there's a bloom. Ruth and I have reached a quiet understanding, too. I no longer feel her actions as a personal violation. I see them as fear and pride and desperation, tempered by love for her son and loyalty to her friends. And I've realized that forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened. It's about noticing the human in front of you and deciding to meet them there anyway. We talk, we laugh, sometimes we cry, and every time the bond is a little stronger. The cafe where this all began in a flash of embarrassment and confusion has become a symbol to me, not of shame or anger, but of perspective. The bell still rings, the espresso machine still hisses, the sandwiches are never perfect, the fries often cold, but the bell is ordinary, and ordinary can be a blessing when you've lived through the extraordinary. Every time I pass by, I remember the panic, the confusion, the shaking of cards that wouldn't work. And then I breathe, and I see the ordinary people around me, some smiling, some frowning, all just living, and I feel a calm I didn't have then. I've learned, too, that life doesn't fix itself. People do, with patience, with honesty, with courage that's quiet and persistent, with a willingness to be vulnerable and still present in the room. The small acts matter: asking before you act, admitting mistakes, setting boundaries, keeping promises, speaking truths even when they're uncomfortable. Those are the acts that stitch a family back together after it frays. Not drama, not rage, not revenge, but steady, stubborn care. There is peace now, though it is a measured peace. We are not perfect, we are cautious, thoughtful, and more aware. But we are here. The house is alive with ordinary sounds: the fridge, the dishwasher, Daniel's late-night footsteps, Mark's whispered apologies for burnt toast, and the soft laughter that creeps in before bed. The threads that could have unraveled us are now woven tighter because we chose to see each other, even when it hurt. If you are listening, sitting in your own version of that cafe, staring at a screen that says something you did not expect, or holding a secret you fear will break your family, remember this: people are complicated, trust is fragile, and mistakes do not define character. Choices do. Pride can make us silent. Love can make us brave. Sometimes the hardest thing is simply staying in the room and letting the conversation happen. So I ask you, if this were your story, would you have stayed? Would you have drawn the boundaries, asked the questions, insisted on honesty even when it hurt? Or would you have walked away thinking the damage was too great to repair? I cannot answer that for you, but I can tell you this: staying taught me more about courage and love than fleeing ever would have. Staying taught me that the ordinary, the burnt toast, the humming fridge, the slowly repaid debts, is where life quietly redeems itself. And staying taught me that even when trust feels broken, it can grow again if tended with patience, truth, and care. And if this story stayed with you, if it made your chest tighten or your heart ache, leave a comment. Tell me what you would do. Tell me what you've learned about trust and family, about pride and courage. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that start with mistakes, with confusion, and end in quiet human understanding, subscribe and stay a while. Sometimes the bell rings not to announce disaster, but to remind us that we are still here, still listening, still capable of love.
The house was quiet that evening. Daniel had fallen asleep in the living room with one leg on the couch and the other on the floor, a textbook half open on the carpet, and Mark had gone outside to check the garden, muttering something about weeds. I sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the empty spaces between my thoughts. I held a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm long ago, but I didn't care. I was trying to feel the weight of everything and nothing at once, letting it settle. It had been months since the cards blocked incident. Months of whispers and lists and silent frustrations. Months of reestablishing trust with Mark. Months of sitting across from Ruth and realizing that people, even those closest to you, can make mistakes, big ones, and still be human. Months of learning that honesty isn't a single moment of confession, it's 1,000 tiny choices you make every day, quietly, with your hands visible. Ruth had started showing up more often, not because she owed us anymore, but because she wanted to see us as partners in life again, not just beneficiaries of our patience. She came over last week with a small loaf of banana bread she'd baked herself. I figured if I'm going to bring a debt, it might as well smell like sugar, she said, laughing softly, eyes crinkled at the corners. And I smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Mark had changed, too, though not in dramatic, sweeping gestures. He had started making a habit of telling me when he was going to do anything with our finances or family matters. He would check in with Ruth in a way that didn't feel secretive, but careful, and he began listening when I asked him questions, not defending or excusing himself, just answering. It wasn't magic, it was work, slow and steady,
and it was building something more resilient than our old routines had ever offered. Even Daniel had changed. I noticed it in small ways, the way he folded his allowance into separate jars for saving, spending, and giving. He asked more questions, not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. "Why do we need 2 accounts now, Mom?" he asked one evening. And instead of rushing through an explanation, I told him in detail how trust worked in money and in relationships, how mistakes don't erase the lessons, and how owning them is just the beginning. He nodded, thoughtful, and then asked if we could make a chart for the week's groceries. I laughed because of course he did. That's how he learned best, with charts and colors and clear markers that told a story better than words alone. Sometimes I still find myself checking the banking app, just a little, almost out of habit. I catch the nervous twitch in my stomach and take a deep breath, reminding myself that the danger isn't the numbers, it's the silence that allows missteps to grow. And I try, every time, to pause before panic. The app no longer feels like a trap, it feels like a tool, a way to see the full picture before acting. I've noticed, too, how ordinary life slowly reclaims its ordinary beauty. The smell of burnt toast from Mark's kitchen experiments, the way Daniel hums when he's building Lego towers taller than he is, the quiet satisfaction when Ruth's roses bloom in her front yard, vibrant against the brick walls. These little moments feel like victories now, because they are. Because life has a way of giving back the ordinary after it has asked so much of you. Mark and I sit on the porch some evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes with conversation. We don't avoid the past, we acknowledge it. We speak of the lessons, the boundaries, the fears, and sometimes we laugh at how dramatic we both were about such small amounts of money, as if the panic could have done more than show us the truth. We've learned that trust is less a thing you reclaim than a garden you nurture. Some days are weeds, some days are sun, and some days, when you least expect it, there's a bloom. Ruth and I have reached a quiet understanding, too. I no longer feel her actions as a personal violation. I see them as fear and pride and desperation, tempered by love for her son and loyalty to her friends. And I've realized that forgiveness isn't about erasing what happened, it's about noticing the human in front of you and deciding to meet them there anyway. We talk, we laugh, sometimes we cry, and every time the bond is a little stronger. The cafe where this all began in a flash of embarrassment and confusion has become a symbol to me, not of shame or anger, but of perspective. The bell still rings, the espresso machine still hisses, the sandwiches are never perfect, the fries often cold, but the bell is ordinary, and ordinary can be a blessing when you've lived through the extraordinary. Every time I pass by, I remember the panic, the confusion, the shaking of cards that wouldn't work, and then I breathe and I see the ordinary people around me, some smiling, some frowning, all just living, and I feel a calm I didn't have then. I've learned, too, that life doesn't fix itself, people do. With patience, with honesty, with courage that's quiet and persistent, with a willingness to be vulnerable and still present in the room. The small acts matter. Asking before you act, admitting mistakes, setting boundaries, keeping promises, speaking truths even when they're uncomfortable. Those are the acts that stitch a family back together after it frays. Not drama, not rage, not revenge, but steady, stubborn care. There is peace now, though it is a measured peace. We are not perfect, we are cautious, thoughtful, and more aware, but we are here. The house is alive with ordinary sounds, the fridge, the dishwasher, Daniel's late-night footsteps, Mark's whispered apologies for burnt toast, and the soft laughter that creeps in before bed. The threads that could have unraveled us are now woven tighter because we chose to see each other even when it hurt. If you were listening, sitting in your own version of that cafe, staring at a screen that says something you did not expect, or holding a secret you fear will break your family, remember this: people are complicated, Trust is fragile, and mistakes do not define character. Choices do. Pride can make us silent. Love can make us brave. Sometimes the hardest thing is simply staying in the room and letting the conversation happen. So I ask you, if this were your story, would you have stayed? Would you have drawn the boundaries, asked the questions, insisted on honesty even when it hurt? Or would you have walked away thinking the damage was too great to repair? I cannot answer that for you, but I can tell you this. Staying taught me more about courage and love than fleeing ever would have. Staying taught me that the ordinary, the burnt toast, the humming fridge, the slowly repaid debts is where life quietly redeems itself. And staying taught me that even when trust feels broken, it can grow again if tended with patience, truth, and care. And if this story stayed with you, if it made your chest tighten or your heart ache, leave a comment. Tell me what you would do. Tell me what you've learned about trust and family, about pride and courage. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that start with mistakes, with confusion, and end in quiet human understanding, subscribe and stay a while. Sometimes the bell rings not to announce disaster, but to remind us that we are still here, still listening, still capable of love.
The morning sunlight poured through the living room window in long golden strips, dust motes dancing lazily in the air. Daniel was curled up on the couch with his homework spread across the cushions, a pencil rolling occasionally to the floor. Mark was in the kitchen, humming softly as he prepared coffee, the scent of dark roast weaving through the quiet. And I was sitting at the edge of the dining table with my cup of tea, listening to the ordinary sounds of life returning and realizing how miraculous ordinary could feel. It's strange how small events leave the deepest marks. A lunch at a cafe, a card that didn't work, a panic that spread across the table like smoke. None of those moments seemed particularly monumental when they happened, but looking back now, I see them as the sparks that ignited change. Those sparks forced us to confront what we were willing to tolerate, what we were willing to forgive, and what kind of family we wanted to be. Ruth came by later that afternoon. She always comes quietly now, with neither fanfare nor apology, just a loaf of banana bread or cookies wrapped in wax paper, and a gentle smile that carries the weight of everything she's learned. Daniel ran to greet her before I could, as if nothing in the past had touched him, and in a way, it hadn't. Not really. Children are forgiving in ways adults envy. We all sat at the kitchen table. Ruth poured tea while Mark buttered a slice of bread. Daniel was chattering about a new project at school, a tower he was building that somehow included a working pulley system made from string and plastic cups. And for a moment, I let myself breathe, let myself be present. I thought about the months we'd lived through, the panic of the blocked cards, the shock of discovering just how much had been moved without my knowledge, the endless small betrayals and misunderstandings. I remembered the hours spent on the phone with the bank, the silent tears in my car, the careful conversations with Mark, the lists, the boundaries, the counseling sessions. I remember the nights when I lay awake thinking of trust as something fragile, like thin glass, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. And yet, here we were. I realized that the story of that lunch, that moment of embarrassment, had never been about money. It had been about respect, about communication, about the quiet truths that get buried under pride and fear. It had been about seeing people, the ones you love and the ones you struggle to understand, not as obstacles, but as humans capable of error and redemption. Ruth reached across the table and brushed a crumb from my sleeve. "You're quiet," he said. His voice carried no accusation, just observation. "I'm thinking about everything, about how fragile we can be and how much work it takes to hold on to trust once it's cracked." He nodded, silently agreeing, and I could feel the weight of his own reflections pressing gently against mine. He too had been changed by the events, not just by what he did, but by seeing me respond with a mixture of firmness and patience. He had learned that intentions, no matter how well-meaning, do not replace transparency. And I had learned that love doesn't end when mistakes happen. It begins again, over and over, in the choice to stay, to speak, to rebuild. Ruth cleared her throat. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about the way I ask for help and how I let pride let it become this wall between us." She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the months of tension and uncertainty. "I don't want that anymore. Not with you, not with him, not with Daniel. I've learned that humility isn't shame and asking isn't weakness." I felt a swell of something, relief, gratitude, hope filling the space between us. "It's not weakness," I said. "It's bravery, and it's brave for all of us to be here, speaking, listening, and still caring for each other." The kitchen was warm, sun spilling across the wooden table. Daniel interrupted us with a question about his tower, and we all laughed. The moment was ordinary, trivial even, but after months of tension, quiet chaos, and fear, the ordinary had become extraordinary. I thought about how trust is like a garden. Once trampled, it takes careful attention to grow again. You cannot force it, you cannot rush it, you must water it with honesty, nourish it with patience, and prune it when pride or fear overgrows its boundaries. And above all, you must allow it sunlight, the vulnerability to be seen fully, flaws and all. Mark reached across again, this time taking my hand. He said, "I'm trying to be better, to be seen, to be trustworthy." "I see you, and I know you're trying. That's the part that matters." We sat like that for a long time, hands touching, hearts leaning towards understanding. No words could undo the past, no gestures could erase the nights of worry or the tears shed over emails and bank statements. But this was the healing. This was the quiet closure we had earned. Acknowledgement, connection, presence. Ruth stood to leave, brushing crumbs from the edge of her apron. "Thank you," she said, simply, "for not giving up, for letting me fix it." I hugged her tightly. "Thank you," I whispered back, "for trying." After she left, Mark and I lingered on the porch for a while, watching the evening light soften against the trees. Daniel's laughter echoed from the living room, and the smell of the last slice of banana bread lingered in the air. The world didn't feel perfect. Trust is never perfect, but it felt whole in a way that mattered. I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Mistakes do not define a person. Trust is a living thing and it must be nurtured. Love is not blind, it is brave.